In an old English manor in the darkest countryside, someone is found murdered. The room in which they were found was locked, with no other apparent means of entry. The only key on the body of the deceased. Signs of forced entry? None. The party guests feign innocence. The staff seem to have no motive and no knowledge. How was the victim killed? Such a setup is a staple of British detective fiction. The opening presents a seemingly impossible scenario. An eccentric detective conducts inquiries. Then, in the finale, they gather everyone in the drawing room and unmask the killer. The reveal takes the form of an explanation. But what is an explanation exactly? What are the qualities of a good explanation, and how do we separate good ones from bad? Are there necessary properties without which something, while it might be an intriguing theory, is not an explanation at all? The example of the whodunit helps prime our intuitions about explanations in general. We can all imagine what might be a satisfying explanation the detective might expound, and what might not be. Consider. The detective gathers the guests and staff into the drawing room and, with great confidence and charisma, declaims, "The killer was one of you." If this were all that was said, I submit we would feel cheated. While the statement may be true in the context of the narrative, it gives us insufficient detail to satisfy epistemically. It constrains the field of possibilities, but not enough. What if instead the detective said, "Aliens did it"? Likewise, I think we'd feel entitled to more. Here, the explanation introduces something more unusual than the phenomenon to be explained, something that requires its own explanation. Which aliens? And how do we know they exist? Aliens are not already part of the causal resources we take to be at our disposal, so their introduction confuses more than enlightens. Even an answer much more typical to the genre, "The butler did it," feels insufficient as an explanation, even if they then confess. The detective would have identified the appropriate agent, but many explanatory gaps remain. How did the butler do it? With what? How did they get into and out of the locked room? Why did they do it? Even a true and appropriate hypothesis is not enough in this context to feel like an explanation. Rather, we are most satisfied when our whodunits end with a detailed causal narrative. We want to be able to follow a chain of actions and motivations that lead us from what we observe, the dead body in the locked room, back to the killer, and even perhaps back to whatever formed their motive to kill. They entered the room using this secret passage behind the bookcase. A scrap of fabric from their coat was torn away by a brazier in the dark passage. They staged the death to look like an accident. They toppled a marble bust on the victim's head, but forgot to wipe off their fingerprints. They left the same way, then fabricated an alibi. They claimed to be here at the time of the murder, but other witnesses saw them there. And they did it because the victim wouldn't acknowledge their parentage. Original birth certificates were found. A satisfying reveal in a whodunit provides a series of well-evidenced steps showing how the murder came about and why. It creates a network of connected causal theories, each ideally supported by independent evidence. We can visualize this. Think of an explanation as like a route across a river. Our goal is to get to the other side. To do this, we do not need a perfectly constructed bridge. We can ford a river on stepping stones, as well as on a complete path. But we need enough stones to enable us to jump from one to another comfortably. If the stones are too far apart, we cannot make the journey safely. If there are no stones and no bridge, we cannot cross the river at all. This metaphor reveals three important things about explanations. First, they are meant to connect things. They connect something proposed as a cause with something proposed as an effect of that cause. The explanation is the connective tissue that joins those things together. Second, that explanations have a purpose. They're meant to help you traverse epistemic terrain. Explanations are not ornamental, they are pragmatic. And third, explanations get better the more you can fill in the gaps between the proposed cause and observed effect. An explanation gets increasingly less satisfactory the fewer stones there are to help you cross the river. A final point needs a little explication here. Sometimes philosophers will seek to make a sharp distinction between causes that are not agents, like the unfolding of natural processes or laws, and causes that are agents, like people. But the whodunit example reveals such a distinction is unnecessary. An agent actually is just a peculiar subset of causes in general, and all agents of which we know work through affecting physical changes. To incorporate an agent into our explanatory structures, we need to have a sense of how the agent works in the world and why it wishes to do particular things. Introducing an agent into an explanatory chain does not relieve us of the responsibility of explaining the mechanisms by which the agent acts. Simply saying, "the butler did it," is not inherently more explanatory than saying it was an accident, unless we already have relevant background knowledge about the butler. Indeed, hypothesizing something was the result of action by an agent can impose additional explanatory responsibilities. We need, in order to create a satisfying explanation, to consider what evidence we have to believe the agent in question would likely act in the way that we are suggesting they acted. We need to demonstrate that there are reasons to believe that our psychological model of the agent is actually correct. Agentic causes don't sit outside or even alongside other non-agentic causes. They are themselves simply part of one single causal explanatory network. The explanations at the end of whodunits are admittedly a little odd, in that they run backwards. They are archetypal examples of what are called abductive explanations. When we engage in deductive reasoning, we stand at one side of the river and progressively build a route to the other side. We ask, given the explanatory materials we have at our disposal, what might we discover? Abductive reasoning, by contrast, works in the opposite direction. We start at the far side of the river, alongside the effect we wish to explain, and we peer back to see plausible routes by which we might have gotten here. We might see in the water a number of different methods of traversal. Perhaps there's an abandoned raft. Maybe that's how we arrived. Perhaps there's a line of slippery stones. Perhaps there is a half-built bridge. These all might, under the right conditions, offer opportunities for us to have crossed. It's perfectly appropriate to evaluate these methods by which we might have crossed the river based on pragmatic considerations. We can say things like this: the raft looks pretty stable, and when I test it, it holds my weight. By contrast, the stepping stones are slippery and treacherous, and it seems unlikely that we could have made it across the section in the middle, where they're so irregularly spaced. And the bridge, well, it would have got us halfway across the river, but then it is unfinished, and I cannot see how we could possibly have got the rest of the way. This sort of comparison enables us to choose between different potential routes and determine which might be the most preferable if multiple options are available. But notice something important. Before we can evaluate the quality of these different routes, we must be confident that at least some of them are actually capable of getting us from one side of the river to the other. It is not, for instance, worth comparing multiple unfinished bridges if it is clear that none of those bridges could actually have brought us safely from bank to bank. We could spend days comparing the grippiness of the tread of each unfinished bridge, tapping at the foundations to see which seems more sturdy, trying to push them, to make them sway, to determine which one stands up better under adverse conditions. But if all of them end far from the bank on which we stand, and if there is no clear mechanism by which we could make the remaining journey, then none of them are viable as routes to connect what we've observed and what we think might be the cause of what we observe. In such a situation, the responsible maneuver is not to plump for one of those bridges anyway, but to be honest and say we do not yet have, even in theory, anything approaching a complete pathway. We can always say of any phenomenon, the current state of the evidence does not allow us to propose an explanation. That is an intellectually honourable and responsible thing to do. Why this focus on the nature of explanation? Because it is my belief that two currently popular approaches to major questions both have the same epistemic flaw. They propose unfinished bridges as explanations for a given phenomenon, then justify adopting their explanation by comparing them to other unfinished bridges. The approaches in question are Intelligent Design and Panpsychism. On the face of it, they may not seem very similar. One is widely understood to be a pseudo-scientific approach to the origin of life, the universe, and everything. The other is a respectable metaphysical view within philosophy. But both, I submit, make the same basic epistemic error. They mistake half bridges for whole ones and overlook primary epistemic inadequacies while hyper-focusing on secondary epistemic qualities. Take first intelligent design, in the form espoused by Stephen Meyer. In a discussion with philosopher Nathan Hawkins, Meyer states that theism has wide and deep, profound explanatory power across multiple aspects of our experience. It provides a better explanation of the origin of life in the universe, the fine-tuning, the information-bearing properties of biomacromolecules and living cells, the origin of the universe. But nowhere in the discussion does Meyer offer an explanation, in terms of theism, of any of those phenomena. An explanation, as in a whodunit, would provide a series of intelligible causal steps leading from observed effect back to proposed cause. It would construct a network of causal relations that would enable us to understand how one thing led to another. Meyer's explanation, by contrast, seems disconnected from such concerns. Instead, it takes the form of that famous cartoon: God exists and can do anything, then a miracle occurs, then we get what we observe. The problem here is not that the hypothesis offered could not in principle be true. It is that the explanation is just a black box. The middle is missing. More worryingly, by proposing an all-powerful immaterial mind as the explanation for things like fine-tuning, we might think we've simply replaced one mystery with another, bigger one. We began having to explain fine-tuning, but now we have to explain God. This is like the detective who appeals to hitherto undiscovered aliens as an explanation for the murder. The answer simply poses bigger questions. Our epistemic state is unadvanced, and may even have gone backwards. So too with panpsychism, the theory that consciousness is irreducible and exists fundamentally at the foundations of reality. Here, Philip Goff is the leading proponent, and in a discussion with Robert Lawrence Kuhn, he unwittingly demonstrates both the explanatory inadequacy of panpsychism and why a focus on secondary epistemic qualities is unwise. First, he says explicitly that all of these philosophical options, physicalism, panpsychism, dualism, at least in certain forms, are empirically equivalent. But if two frameworks are permanently empirically and inquiry equivalent, then the differences between them are not explanatory differences in the sense I described. Because the value of an explanation lies in its ability to causally connect different phenomena. It is inherently, at least in principle, open to empirical test. We can say how changing one thing would change what we observe because we have a network of relationships relating one to the other. Goff's approach turns metaphysical options into overlays divorced from explanatory relation, making them useless. In the face of this problem, he offers two options. Agnosticism, saying we don't know yet which metaphysical framework best explains this observation, that's the position I take, or attention to secondary epistemic features like simplicity. But as I've argued, secondary epistemic features are close to unimportant until the primary purpose of explanation is achieved. Get us across the river. No worries, says Goff. In fact, panpsychism does explain something better than physicalism. While physicalism cannot show how consciousness emerges from matter, he claims, we can show how matter emerges from consciousness. It's worth quoting Goff at length here because it reveals the problem in his argument. He says, in terms of the panpsychist project of trying to account for the emergence of physical reality in terms of consciousness, I think actually we've worked out how to do that. In a sense, the mysteries are solved. And here we draw inspiration from the very important work of Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. Russell's great insight here was that physics is just mathematical structure. And so, in a sense, physics doesn't care what's at the bottom of reality. All physics cares about is that it has the right mathematical structure. Whatever's down there in the base of reality, as long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to get physics out of that. As Stephen Hawking said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So contemporary Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychists draw inspiration from this, and they theorize that at the fundamental level, we have very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways, and through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures, and then the claim is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. It's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. And so in this way, we get physics out of some more fundamental story about consciousness. where is the explanation here? Panpsychists, he says, theorize that at the fundamental level, we have very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways, and through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures, and then the claim is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. But how? How do they interact? How, through their interactions, do they realize what patterns? Again, the middle is missing. And without that, we don't have a bridge. It's rather like saying, when asked how we arrived at this side of the river, I can explain it. We were once over there, and now we are here. The mysteries are all solved. That is, I grant, a hypothesis that fits the data. It would, if true, make the data less surprising. It does not explain the data. With panpsychism, the mysteries of consciousness are not solved. They've just been relabeled. The common epistemic deficit of both intelligent design and panpsychism is what I call a missing middle. Effects are not sufficiently connected to proposed causes through intelligible causal steps, despite the theories having some epistemic qualities. I call such theories that have certain properties of explanations but never connect the thing to be explained to its proposed cause, Nonsplanations. They have some of the epistemic features of explanations and can be described in such a way that they almost feel like explanations. Much is made of their secondary epistemic features, like their simplicity or parsimony. But that process is like a magic trick, because it serves to obscure, at least at some degree, their primary epistemic inadequacy. They don't get us across the damn river. The interrogation of secondary epistemic qualities of nonsplanations is not precisely pointless. We can learn something from asking which of these nonsplanations is the simplest or most elegant. We can learn, for instance, about what it means for a theory to be simple or elegant. But this approach is epistemically unwise because it mistakes the epistemic task and focuses our attention on the wrong thing. For while we are admiring the beautiful buttresses of one entirely unfinished bridge, we are not seeking the path of smooth, flat stones that may be hidden just around the river's bend. There are costs to epistemic inattention. It's not entirely clear that it even makes sense to focus on secondary epistemic properties before primary ones are established, because until we know what sort of explanation we need, we do not know which secondary qualities are most important. It is not always the case that the simplest or most elegant explanation is best, and the only way to tell is to view the complete explanation in epistemic context. Sometimes we want a weighty brick bridge, other times a flexible rope bridge. But until we know more about the problems we're seeking to solve, we cannot tell. So the immediate task for ID proponents and panpsychists is the same. Stop admiring your half-finished bridge and ford the river entire. Then we can ask whether your bridge is beautiful. How might you know if you're being offered a nonsplanation? I have a simple test. Ask yourself, of the proposed hypothesis, if this hypothesis were true, what difference would it make to inquiry? If the answer is none, if it doesn't show you where to look for more evidence, if it doesn't constrain your explanatory options, if it doesn't open up rich new seams of inquiry, it doesn't do anything, then it is not an explanation in any sense. It may be that the hypothesis, were it true, would give rise to what we observe, rendering that observation less surprising. Fine. That's not nothing. But it is not an explanation, because it does not ford the river of the unknown.